What's up guys, it's me Jeremy. With Preseason 8 only a few months away, Riot has been pretty hard at work figuring out the perfect keystone to introduce with the upcoming Rune update. And in the interest of gaining some early community feedback and suggestions, Riot Meddler opened up a discussion on the League of Legends forums to gather some ideas for the final keystone in the inspiration tree, which actually led to Riot Meddler messing around with a bunch of ideas and also talking a lot about the designs that they tested in the past that they decided not to go with. So today I wanted to showcase some of these cancelled keystone concepts that Riot had been considering but of course were eventually rejected. One player named Velzard of Cause came up with the idea of allowing a player to demolish a small part of a wall, with the idea that it would be pretty niche based on whether or not you had a gap closer on your champion. And Riot Meddler responded that Riot had actually tested a very similar rune that worked on the same basis but had a different execution. The rune actually gave you the ability to walk through thin walls, meaning some terrain could essentially be ignored while other parts would not be able to be traversed. During the testing, it was found that junglers were actually really the only types of characters that could benefit from it, although Meddler also noted that Velzard's suggestion of allowing players to destroy walls could potentially actually be an improvement on that design, since it wouldn't be so limiting. He also mentioned that despite it being a really cool idea, Riot does care a lot about making things look good, and the art cost of doing something like removing walls is kind of just out of the scope of the update right now. It's something that would take too long to develop. They could always go for something closer to maybe a little bit of a mini Bard E to get the same practical effect, but assuming the destruction was meant to be permanent, having a permanent Bard tunnel on various parts of the map would really be just all kinds of weird stuff going on. A couple of other players also suggested a concept of what Riot called PostDeath Effects, meaning things that you can essentially activate after you die to allow you to keep contributing to a fight even if you maybe just get picked off early on. Now this would actually kind of potentially be pretty broken on a lot of champions, but a player named Canaletto suggested it with a little bit of a twist. Make it so that none of your attacks or abilities deal damage, so that you could only contribute utility or crowd control for a few seconds. Now this would make it a pretty terrible keystone on carries, but could be something that could be pretty cool to use on a tank or support character, and Meddler commented of course that Riot had actually been testing something very similar with a Karthus sort of passive style effect, but Riot's twist on it was to make it so that you could only cast abilities that worked on your allies. Now the feedback from testing that sort of ability resulted in it just being really underutilized, and people kind of just don't really like post-death abilities because the level of variance in their actual usability is really high. You know, most of the time you're not trying to die anyway, and Riot Meddler lists Sion, Zyra, and Kog'Maw's passives as sort of examples to back up those points. That being said though, Riot are still looking into ways to make it work, but they maybe want to find a way to give players some power that isn't totally reliant on them dying first to maybe make it a bit more reasonable. Another really cool suggestion that leads us into our next scrapped keystone rune comes from a player named Dark Ritual, who had an idea for something called the Black Market Access card that would essentially give you the ability to buy stealth wards, mana potions, and other assorted items that are otherwise unavailable and have been removed from the game really. He suggested that they could maybe be rebalanced versions of removed items or new unique items. And Riot Meddler mentioned that he saw a lot of potential in this idea, but that they had actually tested some similar ideas, although not any that were exactly like that one. Despite it being a really awesome concept, there's a lot of hurdles attached to that sort of thing that Riot would have to overcome. I mean, to start with, despite offering a fair bit of power, it wouldn't really feel as satisfying to use as maybe some other keystones. It also adds just a ton of complexity, and it can totally dramatically change the game for both your team, yourself, and the enemy team too when you're using these new exclusive items. And there's also the drawback of all sorts of heavy, intense balancing and maintenance. It would take a lot of time for Riot to keep that sort of thing balanced, bug-free, and really just working for everyone. And you could also argue that they should really just spend that time working on items for everyone to use instead, rather than items for this exclusive keystone shop. Now the next suggestion came from a user named Monado II, suggesting an ability to turn a friendly ward into a trap that could be activated by an enemy that got too close. and Riot Meddler responded that a very similar concept had been tested already, causing all wards placed by the Keystone wielder to shoot little lasers at nearby enemies. These shots would slow them down and actually deal damage in some versions, but unfortunately it led to some really weird perspectives on how the vision system was meant to function, and depending on which version of the Keystone was used, it would either be frustrating to counterplay or would just make your wards too easy to destroy and be relatively useless. However, Riot Meddler noted that Monato's approach of requiring it to be done to a specific ward could actually maybe mitigate some of those issues. Riot would have to do some, fine-tuning to the cooldown and mechanics, of course, but it's something that might actually be tested again by Riot thanks to the suggestion. Now, another player by the name of Robert du Belmont inquired about the potential of tweaking vision as a possible Keystone route, maybe in the form of something like enhanced wards, something like increasing the vision range on them. Meddler's response was pretty straightforward. Any vision dedicated Keystone, assuming it was balanced and therefore a good choice to actually take, kind of leads to a world where at least one person on every team, probably the support of course, ends up getting just absolutely forced into taking that Keystone, which also just forces them into that specific tree, which really removes the ability to choose your own playstyle for actually a good amount of players, kind of defeating the entire point of the system. On top of that, it's likely a Keystone that, despite its effectiveness, is something that's not really all that fun to play with. It's not very satisfying for most players. After all, most players are not super excited about buying wards in the first place, or maybe paying for a sightstone that's kind of mandatory, or really just playing support in general, and a vision-focused Keystone would essentially be more the same instead of anything new and exciting. Now, our next scrap Keystone was spotted by user Nalith, who asked about the Alchemy tab shown in the Summoner Specialist Keystones example GIF. Meddler gave a little context, mentioning that the Alchemy tab was actually left over from a previous Keystone test, and Riot simply reused the UI while prototyping Summoner Specialist. When pressed about this previous Keystone, Meddler revealed that Riot had been toying with the idea of letting players buy from a set of unique elixirs that would give you some cool stats and maybe a unique effect. You apparently couldn't buy them with gold. It would either be tied to a cooldown or a currency unique to this specific Keystone. It actually had some pretty interesting play apparently, since you could gain bonuses like some AP, or maybe something like a Luden's Echo style mini proc effect, but at the end of the day it was a little bit too complex, and the end result was a little bit too stat driven for Riot's liking. There would always be one that was just way better than the others based on the balancing. Another suggestion based on the current Biscuit mastery was made by Vonler, who suggested a way to affect potions with your rune choices. His example was called Potion Dealer, giving players the ability to use health potions on an allied champion. And Riot Stashu responded in a similar way to Riot Meddler in the previous example. Alchemy-inspired Keystones just hadn't really worked the way that Riot would have liked them to. On the other hand, they hadn't considered trying anything like that specific Potion Dealer concept, although it may run into the same issues as the vision-based Keystone in that it kind of just ends up becoming this must-pick Keystone to have on every team, which is the type of gameplay that nobody really wants from this system for sure. Riot Meddler also added his own thoughts on a couple additional rune concepts that hadn't been tested until recently. One example was Hextech Multitool, another idea from Dark Ritual that would reduce Hextech item cooldowns by 5 seconds and give them individual cooldowns rather than the current shared system. Riot Meddler mentioned that although an item master Keystone could have promise, it kind of becomes a trap for players if they shouldn't really be stacking those items in the first place. In that case, it would be pretty important to add something more unique than the removal of shared cooldowns to make it both more fun and to avoid any burst damage issues from stacked Hextech items. Another player named Jabalor also suggested 2 ideas that hadn't been tested yet, the first of which was called Witch Skin, which caused enemy spells to have a chance to grant mana or a shield if your mana bar was full. He also suggested a keystone called Iron Bones, which would cause you to lose 10% of your move speed but also take 15% less damage. Riot Meddler noted that they were really interesting and potentially kind of exciting ideas, especially the trade-off of damage reduction for a self-slow, but apparently they would make better fits for regular runes rather than keystones, just not really on the sort of power level or design style that they're trying to go with the whole keystone rune archetype. Keystones need to have a certain power level and some kind of tactical decision making to them, whereas these effects were kind of just passive overall. Either way, there were some really cool ideas coming out from the community here, and it was really cool to see rioters actively reaching out to the players for suggestions, as well as giving feedback on what would work and maybe what wouldn't. Hopefully we see more of this type of thing from Riot in the future, and maybe we'll see some player suggestions actually become the third inspiration tree keystone. Although it's maybe a little bit unlikely to be any of these, since pretty much all the ones we talked about today have been tested and scrapped in some way, shape, or form. Either way though, hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like, and if you didn't, feel free to hit the dislike button too. Thank you guys so much for watching, subscribe if you want, and I'll see you guys next time.